Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our latest edition of our Basel IV-Channel. Today's topic is again a credit risk topic, especially regarding the IRB approach. Today's topic is the draft RTS on the specification of the nature, the severity and the duration of an economic downturn when you estimate LGDs and CFFs. This draft RTS was published by the EBA earlier this year and does not directly relate to Basel IV, but nevertheless, because under Basel IV also the IRB approach will be changed, it's definitely also important to consider the proposals coming from the EBA under the topic Future of the IRB. As always, I would like to use the opportunity to introduce myself. My name is Neisen. I'm partner at PwC and leading the Global Basel IV initiative. Again, I'm not alone today making this speech. I have two really good experts on the topic IRB with me. One is Kaan Aksel and the other one is Radka Margitova. Kaan, Radka, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. This is Kaan Aksel. I'm working very closely with Radka and Martin on various topics related to credit risk modeling, especially in the area of PD and LGD model development. And today, one of these topics will be discussed in detail. That will change the way we will be going forward using in the LGD model development.
Hello, also from my side, Radka Margitova. I'm Senior Manager here in PwC Germany. I have been working on credit risk related topics since 2007, and here with PwC I'm responsible for the consulting team on credit risk topics. I have a broad spectrum of different modeling expertise on modeling development, implementation, redesign and recalibration, as well as validation of rating models. In the last couple of years, we focus on future of the RBA, then targeted review of internal models and IFRS 9. And today we are going to talk about the LGD and CFF modeling.
Okay, thank you very much, Radka. Thank you very much, Kaan. Okay, let's have a quick look to the agenda of today's Basel IV-Channel episode. We will start with a quick introduction. Where does this RTS come from? What is the purpose of this RTS and how it's related to Basel IV and the rest of the EBA proposals considering the future of the IRB? And then we directly go into the details. There are altogether three approaches proposed by the EBA on how to calculate the downturn effect on LGDs and CFFs. There's one model component approach, which is the standard approach, considering what EBA says in their document. And there are two alternative approaches. The first one is the reference value approach, quite pragmatic alternative to the model component approach, which is much more sophisticated. And the second alternative approach is the so-called supervisory add-on approach, which is quite conservative but a real simple approach on how to estimate the downturn effect. After getting a little bit more into detail regarding the three approaches, we are going to compare the three approaches and look what are the biggest advantages, disadvantages and the biggest challenges. And last but not least, of course, we are going to give you a conclusion and a rationale. So let's hand over to the experts and start the presentation on the downturn estimates for LGDs and CFFs. Please.
The requirements of LGD and CFF, so credit loss given default and conversion factor estimation to reflect economic downturn conditions, was introduced firstly by the Basel II regulation, and then in the current CRR, this is also a topic which is captured in Article 181, where the CRA is also giving the hint that an RTS will be developed to define the nature, severity, and duration of economic downturn. So this was the first hint that the consultation paper, which came out in March 2017, has to be introduced by the EBA. The topic of downturn LGD is not only on the EBA part or the European part, but it's also been a topic from the Basel Committee. So in BCBS 362, the Basel Committee also see that there is a lot of variation in the RWAs because of different calculation methodologies of the downturn LGD and CF, and also introduces floor and an overview how LGDs are to be looked at in the future. In the latest RTS or final RTS on RB assessment methodology, which came out in July 2016, there are also specific topics on how the LGD in default has to be estimated, and also still no other hints, although, to the topics of how nature, severity, and duration of economic downturns are to be implied in the estimation of the parameters. In November 2016, so last year in November, a consultation paper came out on the guidelines of PD and LGD estimation, which gives a good overview on how, going forward, the LGD and CF estimation has to be done. And in this topic, there were additional requirements regarding downturn LGDs, and also the specific hint that a consultation paper is going to come out. And then, in March 2017, this consultation paper really came out and gave us an overview of how the future downturn LGD and CF are going to be estimated. So the so long expected RTS on the economic downturn has a consultation paper as until today, and is going to be implemented by end of 2020. The interesting part is that the institution should estimate always the downturn LGDs and the conversion factors by looking at the most severe times and also conducting these economic downturns within the estimate. The RTS was set out that it's been introduced because it has to reduce the unjustified variability of capital requirements and also assure consistent risk-weighted exposure amounts, but also ensure consistency in the model outputs. And here the focus is definitely on the consistency, as we are going to see in the approaches proposed. So within the paper, EBA proposes 3 approaches how downturn LGDs and CCFs are to be estimated. The first one is the model component approach as the main approach, which is the main approach of this paper. It defines the economic downturn conditions as a period of time characterized by unfavorable level of economic factors influencing relevant features of the realized losses and drawings. The second approach proposed is a bit pragmatical approach, and the third one, the supervisory add-on approach, just gives the conservative simplified approach, which is of course more conservative than the model component approach. Between the consultation paper on RTS on economic downturn and, on the other hand, the consultation paper currently still in consultation on guideline on PD and LGD estimation, there is a very good connection, because in the consultation paper on RTS economic downturn, there are also some amendments of the guidelines which are currently in consultation, so in the November consultancy paper. The mandate of the RTS does not cover the methods used to reflect the economic downturn conditions into downturn LGD and conversion factors. These are included for the LGD as proposed amendments to the downturn adjustment section in the guidelines, which are currently, as I said, in the finalization stage. Also, an appropriate margin of conservatism in the LGD should be additionally introduced because of the identification of the nature of the macroeconomic factors or credit factors is only based on qualitative analysis, or if the severity is not sufficiently severe enough, or there are different gaps in the data. So let us just look for a minute over the model component approach as it is. It starts with general requirements on choosing the appropriate economic downturn for each type of exposure and also considering different justification. Then the next point is that the model component has to be chosen. And when I'm saying a model component, then I mean that there has to be at least 2 model components, and for each and every component, at least one macroeconomic factor has to be established. And this is what the consultation paper is saying. And when looking at this model component, so you have one LGD, then you have to have at least 2 model components in this LGD, and this quantitative variable, so the components as it is, have to explain the multimodality of the LGD as such. The same also is applicable on CF. As soon as we have the model component, the next step we have to do under the model component approach is to estimate the macroeconomic or credit factors, the so-called economic factors, which are likely to affect the model component. There is a list given by the EBA, of course not exhaustive, and as I said, at least one factor per model component should be available. As soon as we have the model components and the macroeconomic credit factors, the next step is to look at each and every macroeconomic factor and decide over the last 20 years what was the severity, what was the severest point in time for this factor. And when I mean for the factor, I don't mean that what was the severe loss or the severe drawing over the last 20 years. I'm just explicitly saying it's about the severity as the factor on a standalone basis. The factors and also the components are going to be introduced are looked at in a 1-year duration for each economic downturn. So the joint impact of all economic factors and model components is to be looked at. The interesting part is that the EBA doesn't really give an approach how the joint impact has to be calculated. It just says that different scenarios are to be looked at, and that all types of exposure should be done separately for LGD and CF estimates. To make the model components approach a bit more understandable, the EBA also introduces an example according to an LGD model here at this slide. As you can see, this model consists of 3 components: the cure rate, LGD cure, and the LGD for liquidation. So the first stop here, or the first step to do in the model component approach, identify the model components, and we have 3 here. The next step is to identify the related economic factors. Here you see that we are looking at GDP growth or house price index changes, credit losses, interest rates, and unemployment rate. And by looking at this, we can see the first issue within this model component approach, which is not really introduced by the EBA or not answered. And this is the no consideration of time lag between the liquidation periods and the economic cycles. So after we chose after we identified the related economic factors, the next thing is to look at what is the severest point in the last 20 years for each and every factor. So find the worst 1-year period, which is shown here according to the different colors. For GDP growth with 2001, for example, or interest rates in 2010. The interesting part afterwards is that we aggregate different scenarios. So, for instance, if we look at scenario A, we are only focusing on the cure rate. So the both factors related to the cure rate here, both in yellow, the GDP growth and the employment rate, are really put in the estimation of the cure rate and are calculated, or and each and every other factor is just the normal one. This is the scenario A, and the scenario B just looks at what will be if we take the severest possible years for each and every factors for the three model components. So these are two scenarios. There are a lot of scenarios also available, and the second issue we also see here is that the scenarios doesn't really account the different correlation between model components on the one side in between each other, or the factors, credit factors or macroeconomic factors on the other side. And there have to be a lot of scenarios calculated, and then as soon as this is done, then the worst one should be also chosen, which means that at the end we will have a very conservative and quote.
Thank you, Radka. The key message is here that the component approach is most likely the preferred approach according to EBA, what we can read between the lines and in the relevant document. Here we are asked to break down the LGD estimation according to the provided formula into three components. These, as you can see on this slide number 8, in the equation on the upper part of the slide, the cure rate, the value for LGD, final LGD number, a figure according to this cured path, and then the LGD estimation for the path of liquidation of the underlying asset, which has been pledged with the corresponding exposure. The example provided in the consultancy paper gives us this time period from 2001 to 2013, and as you can see, there are two major scenarios indicated. One is scenario A, the other one is B. The scenario A is related to a downturn year, as it has been here given the example 2001, and scenario B is related to the period between 2008 and 2013, and which should be accordingly the next recession period or economic downturn period. To understand this conceptual design of the framework, I think we need to really walk you through all through the example in a detailed fashion. Here, slide number 9, where we can see the same formula again, and we need to identify the components. That is, I think, where the names component approach is coming from. The first component is the cure rate. The second component is the LGD, final LGD value for the cure rate path, and the third component is, model component, is the LGD value for the liquidation path. Liquidation path, as the name goes, standing there for the fact that the underlying attached or pledged collateral has been liquidated. And one has to also make a note here that the modeling LGD should have, in fact, these three components if you want to make use of this approach. And that's actually one of the reasons why many banks which doesn't have these three components as it's been sorted out in this formula can apply this approach with ease if and when they, for instance, use a different LGD estimation methodology than what has been provided according to this formula. In the second step, we need to identify the relevant economic factors for the so-called downturn periods and related to the so-called model components. We need to analyze the dependency between the economic factor and the components and make sure that the relevant economic factor is here identified, which has a strong correlation with the individual component in terms of changing the value of the final LGD estimation number. According to this example, the first component, which was the Q rate, is more or less explained. The variability in the Q rate is explained according to analysis by the economic factor GDP growth and unemployment rate. And for the second component, the variability in the value of the second component, which is the LGD Q, has been explained by the economic factor interest rates. And finally, for the third component, the variability in the value of this component has been explained by the house prices and credit losses. In other words, we have here 5 macroeconomic factors, the 2 of them having a strong relationship with the first component, and the third one with the second component, and the last 2 are having very strong correlation with the third component. And let's see how this whole thing fits together. According to the paper, we need to establish the downturn period for which this economic factor is relevant and identified. And here we have on this slide number 10 a table which is showing clearly per economic factor the relevant downturn period, which is referring to the worst period for which the value of the economic factor has been calculated or estimated, and then we have the value of the economic factor in the downturn period, and the model component value associated with the worst 1-year average of the economic value are also here on the slide reflected. So if we have already identified as the downturn scenario A the period T1, then we can easily figure out that in this period the economic factor, the first economic factor, we're having an influence on the model component 1. All the other factors have not been necessarily influenced in this downturn period. We're not really showing any downturn effect. In other words, for the downturn period 2, 3, 4, and 5, the economic factors corresponding 2, 3, 4, 5 are all important, respectively. They all belong to the downturn scenario B. But the key thing is here, in this, according to the downturn scenario B, we do not have the first economic factor, which had played there in this, according to the scenario, a role. So in other words, for scenario A, the relevant economic factor is the first one, and for scenario B, the relevant economic factors are 2, 3, 4, and 5. Let's see how it works in terms of the final numbers. Then we measure basically the value of the LGD, downturn LGD, or the value of the LGD according to the formula, where we have to take the first component being influenced by the economic factor, where we take the worst value that has been observed in the downturn period 1. But according to scenario A, the components 2 and 3 have not necessarily been influenced by the relevant economic factors during this period. So therefore, we will be using the long-run averages for this component values, which is what we usually have been calculating using the long-run average as LGD estimation procedure. Similarly, for the scenario B, we know that the components 2, 3, and 4 have going to be influenced. So therefore, we are going to be using their worst values, but for the model component 1, we will be using the long-run average value, because according to the scenario B, this component will not be necessarily influenced. So the fact is, scenario B had no effect economically when we have to interpret this as such on the first component. So the effect will be only reflected on component, second component, and third component. Okay, and then in the final count, we have estimated based on the worst values for the relevant scenarios and for the relevant downturn periods, the LGD final numbers, and then we will take which one is the worst, whether the one, if the one according to scenario B is the worst, then we will take this as the downturn value, final downturn value for the LGD downturn estimation. The problem is here, there is no indication, as you might have already figured out, how the correlations will play a role. Some of the scenarios might be, in fact, very strongly correlated, but at the end of the day, we are here more or less imposed a framework where we need to make sure that we do not take into account the correlation impact. On the slide number 12, we will be elaborating shortly about the alternative approaches that has been also proposed according to this paper. These are namely the reference value approach and supervisory add-on approach. The reference value approach indicates that there's no need for dependency analysis between the identified factors and institutions' LGD model components. The reference value is more driven by taking the average of the two highest LGD estimations from the historical past. And here, as the historical observation period is at the beginning of the paper indicated a period of 20 years. But of course, this is for many institutions, as far as we know them, a very difficult topic because they don't have such far-reaching historical data that I have collected for the LGD estimation. The reference value that has been found out will be used as a floor for the final downturn LGDs. Overall aim is here to really to decrease the burden of the institution to follow who cannot really follow the comprehensive methodology, because either the modeling methodology is different than the components that have been earlier mentioned, or they might find not this approach reasonable for their specific portfolios. Of course, this approach, reference value approach, will heavily rely on a degree of judgment in the course of assessment, because you have to identify the two highest LGDs corresponding to recession years. In many West European countries, what the recession years really are constitutes a significant problem, because some countries have not really observed a real downturn or recession in the last 25-30 years. The second alternative approach is supervisory add-on approach. Here, the LGD is estimated as the commonly known long-run average, and there on the top of that, an add-on has to be provided, which is computed more or less depending on the observed credit losses at the institutional level. In this approach, the add-on can be calculated either by using the standardized methodology of observing the actual observations from year to year of recovery values, which we call sometimes as well recovery vintages. So if you have from year to year a certain standard deviation from the average in your recovery values, then you can use the standard deviation as, let's say, one standard deviation as the add-on on the top of the long-run average, which has been also used since the early days of LGD estimation as a clear indication for this method. The discounting rate changes the second methodology. I mean, you can change your discounting rate in order to find out a different value for the expected recovery cash flows. Is an alternative. You can create, you can calculate your average long-run LGD estimation using a 5% discounting rate, as the paper, consultancy paper for PD and LGD estimation has indicated that, and then for add-on we might want to use additional 5% add-on and be using 10% on the top of the base rate as the risk premium. You can calculate the downturn add-on value. These two approaches we can easily say will found their own proponents and opponents. Clearly depends quite a lot on which methodology the banks have been initially embarked on in the estimation of their LGD values. Some banks might find the component approach easier than the other ones, but at the end of the day, there are certain workload and effort attached to that depending on the complexity. And the model component approach is quite complex, as you might need to do this thing for individual portfolios, and it might be very difficult establish the economic relationship based on statistical observations if you have limited data, and therefore data requirements are quite high. Similarly, it might be very difficult to do this exercise for some type of portfolios such as the low default portfolio structures. The reference value approach is certainly less cumbersome and more straightforward. Supervisory approach has been mostly perceived to be the easiest and the most effortless to be handled by a large majority of the banking community. On slide number 14, we would like to give some hands-on summary here. It's expected that this technical standard may lead to significant changes in various LGD modeling work that has been already carried out by the banks. Practically all LGD methods have to be somehow affected by this. There are obviously some synergies to stress testing methods that has been currently established by various institutions to incorporate the macroeconomic scenarios. More detailed stress testing approaches might find some value in application of this new methodologies to estimate the downturn. Similarly, if banks are already working on the IFRS 9 implementation projects and where they have to integrate the macroeconomic aspects in the IFRS 9 provisioning calculations, they might find the development of this additional downturn LGD mechanically easier, because they would have already been collecting the data for the purposes of the implementation project. There are certainly challenges, and clearly a history of 20 years of loss for certain portfolios are expected, which might seem to be a science fiction in light of the available data for several banks where not more than 5 or 6 years loss data has been already in place. Data sets are different. I mean, the IFRS 9 has some different requirements to comply with, so conforming IFRS 9 requirements for data collection doesn't make the data conforming the RTS standard as we have been describing them. Careful selection of the approach is necessarily of essential value. Banks have to assess here to make here cost-benefit ratio analysis and figure out which way they have to choose. In most cases, we would expect that the banks will create the downturn analysis, LGD estimation analysis from the scratch, giving up the previous approaches that they have been adhering to. Similarly, identification of relevant macroeconomic effects and components and their dependency to the model components might prove to be difficult for certain territories, for certain countries, where the impact of macroeconomic cycle cannot be really felt or measured in statistical terms with ease. And with here, I would like to give the words back to my colleague Radka.
Yes, in the latest update which we had on a downturn LGD on the EBA hearing in London in beginning of April. There are certain topics which are important with this consultation paper. So the RTS is going to be is finalized as of today, or the consultation stage, and the finalization of the responses is going to be in the third quarter of 2017. So we are going to expect the final RTS as a Christmas gift, maybe in the fourth quarter. As we saw, the consultation paper on economic downturn is very close to the guideline on PD and LGD estimation. So these are currently in the finalization stage, and with relationship to the guidelines, PD and LGD estimation or the treatment of defaulted assets are all going to be taken into account when finalizing the RTS. There are also not only interactions with the EBA papers, but also with the Basel work. The EBA is really participating in the Basel work and is also taking a close look and monitoring the process, the progress, in order to have the same timeliness and also the same requirements. As we said, several amendments to the downturn adjustments of the guideline on PD and LGD estimations are done. And just to give you an overview, additionally to the introduced margin of conservatism, there are also some prudential downturn LGD. What I mean with prudential downturn LGD is that the LGD is going to be computed at a grade or pool level, and according to the final downturn scenario selected in line with the RTS. On the LGD model level. So we are going to have much prudential values here. And also, when using the realized or estimated value for each model component in the respective economic downturn scenario, which belong to the final downturn scenario, this will be additional conservatism which is going to be introduced in the downturn LGD. Yes, the clarification around the RTS also already mentioned the margin of conservatism, which should be reflected because of the nature of the economic downturn, only based on a qualitative assessment, or when we are looking at the severity, if the severity is not sufficient enough, or if the model components are estimated during a downturn period. And of course, the higher documentation requirements which are set out within this RTS. So these are the latest news. I think that in summer or in beginning of autumn we're going to hear something new on it. So stay tuned.
Yeah, thank you very much, Radka. Thank you very much, Kaan. That was really a very, very interesting presentation. And even if the estimation of the downturn effect for CCFs and LGD is only a small requirement when you look to the Basel II text or the CRR text, it becomes very quickly clear that the effect of this proposal coming from the EBA might be quite significant. On the one hand side, of course, when we look to the implementation, especially of the model component approach, that approach is really sophisticated and a challenge in the implementation. But on the other hand, if you look to the two other approaches, more simple approaches, they are quite conservative, and it will definitely have a quite big impact on the value of the parameters. Yeah, maybe in the end, please give me the possibility also to raise your attention to two recent publications of PwC experts. Both books are called Basel IV. One is in German edition, the other one is an English edition. This Basel IV book is the first of its kind. It's the first global publication on this topic and covers all topics that we are also covering in our Basel IV-Channel, but of course much more in detail and also with some examples for the calculation. We cover all three major risk types, market risk, credit risk and operational risk, and both always the standardized approaches and the internal models. Apart from that, we also give further details on new disclosure requirements for the calculation of risk-weighted assets for investment funds. We have the capital floors, and all of these articles in this book cover the latest rumors coming from the Basel Committee and should be close to the final regulation that will be published this year. So if you're interested to go a little bit more into detail, I can definitely recommend you these two books, one in the English version and the other one in the German version. Yeah, that's it for today. I would like to thank you for your attention on this latest edition of the Basel IV-Channel. If you have any further questions, do not hesitate to contact us or the referring experts. If you are interested in other topics regarding the IRB approach or Basel IV, do not hesitate to look to our Basel IV webpage or the Basel IV-Channel. So thank you very much again. Thank you very much, Kaan. Thank you very much, Radka. Hope to hear you next time. Bye-bye.